What else is Gender Parity UK fighting for and want people to look at and highlight?
We're very concerned on the domestic abuse front about what's being portrayed for men. We are concerned that there is massive insufficiency in service provision for male victims of domestic abuse. We feel that there's a big problem with recognition of male victims of domestic abuse. For instance, they're more likely to be the victims of parental alienation and false allegations of abuse. And in particular, there's this tendency to call a person a victim immediately upon allegation. So the accuser is called a victim straight away, and the accused is called a perpetrator, and that's leaked into the CPS documents, that's leaked into throughout the system. It's totally prejudging completely on subjective bases, as we talked about before, but it creates it creates a circumstance where you're not very likely to have sympathy or empathy for the actual victim, who is the victim of the false allegations. The person who's being made these false allegations against is being pilloried by the police, and it's called they call it legal and administrative aggression. And what happens is, if you can make a false allegation and you can get the police involved to, on your behalf, punish the person. I know a guy who's been arrested 6 times, all NFAs, who was in prison, who was in jail for a while. He tried suicide. It was just absolutely devastating on him. And it's simply this woman who just wants to cause him pain and harm. And he hasn't even been appointed an IDVA, an independent domestic violence assistant. He hasn't had any support. Police aren't interested. No one's following up on this. And this, domestic abuser is basically just absolutely free to continue her campaign of abuse against him. And it's very tough on him. Fortunately, most domestic abuse people eventually grow out of, but it's a horrendous position for him.
Yeah, I've actually done some research on this for a new book I'm writing that'll be out next year. And from what I've read from proper government studies, is 50% of all domestic violence is where the man and the woman are equally to blame. One day he's hitting her, next day she's hitting him. It's just different days, different times, usually alcohol related. So 50% of all domestic violence, they're both to blame. And then the other 50%, the majority of that, it's the woman hitting the man. The only difference is men are more powerfully built. So when a man hits a woman, there's a lot more damage. When a woman slaps a man or scratches a man, there's not much evidence there. And I think a lot of this comes down to, many, many urban myths. If you look at the film Colour Purple is all about domestic violence, the big bad man beating up a woman. And this goes through a lot of our soaps, a lot of our social narratives, a lot of our stories and books people read. It's this continual narrative that men are big in evil and are always picking and beating women up. And it's completely untrue. There's a tiny, tiny, tiny majority. There's a tiny, tiny percentage of men who may hit women, but it's completely tiny.
It's such a complex area. The data that I've got, which was based on a US United States assessment, was 70% bidirectional abuse, of which about, and the remainder 30% was about evenly split between the men and the women as the instigators. And of that 70%, there was a roughly equal split of about 15% for male self-defense and female self-defense. And this was, of course, under the American concept of domestic violence, they call it, in which they've included non-violent violence, if you like. And we have a different way of looking at it. We have domestic violence, we have domestic abuse. And domestic violence, the old, man in a stained singlet drinking beers and, beating up his wife. That's way down. That's way down on the year 2000. It's like 70% down just on the year 2000. And these NGOs that were set up and received a lot of government money to protect women are all of a sudden looking at a graph that's going like this for their market, basically. And if you might have a not-for-profit entity, but that doesn't mean you're not-for-profit.
And that doesn't mean you've not got a fantastic gold-plated pension.
Yeah, $260,000 a year. Yeah.
It's the same in the charity sector. So you'll have children in need, not children in need. You'll have Save the Children, or some of these others. And what happens is once they see that they're solving the problem, they then have to redefine the problem so they can continue. So they continue with their great wages and their pension. So therefore, we'll never solve poverty, because the second we get close to solving poverty, they'll redefine poverty and we're back at square one again. The whole thing's a con.
Oh, I wouldn't say it's a con, but as you approach that asymptote, right? That's as you get to the point where there's some level of domestic abuse that or domestic violence that you're probably never going to get rid of, and that's the seriously mentally disturbed people. There's definitely psychopaths out there. So but the closer you get to that asymptote, the less growth potential you've got, and the more shrill the voices get. It's so much harder for me to say to you that someone having a bank account is domestic abuse, right? So that's what we're coming into now. If you have your own bank account instead of a joint bank account, well, you're economically abusing your partner. Come on. But it's getting close to that,
and that's about redefining what domestic abuse and violence is, so the projects can continue running.
Yeah. Well, exactly. Oh, yeah. But also, that's really hard to convince you that that's actually domestic abuse, right? As a lay person, right? So what we're finding is I believe the voices are just getting incredibly shrill and very vocal, and they won't tolerate anyone saying, well, hang on a minute, that's not really that bad. And it's getting more and more forceful because they are just trying to make you accept the false narrative that domestic abuse is increasing, when in fact it's fallen off a cliff and it's continually going down. And
that's that. Well, let's be honest, that's great news. I'm glad domestic violence is falling off a cliff, because no man should hit a woman and no woman should hit a man.